It begins not with a discovery, but with a silence that lingers in the corners of libraries, in the dust that gathers on forgotten manuscripts, and in the gaps between what we think we know and what the past still refuses to tell us. History, we often say, is written by the victors, but perhaps that isn't entirely true. Perhaps history is written by survivors, by those whose records endured long enough to be believed. The rest, the ones that contradict the neat timeline we've built for ourselves, are sealed away, mislabeled, or dismissed as myth. And yet, every so often, something surfaces. A manuscript no one can read. A record that extends the age of kings beyond reason. A pyramid rising where no civilization was meant to stand. Each one whispers a quiet question to us across the centuries. What if the story of humanity is older, stranger, and more beautiful than we have dared to imagine? We live in an age of data, of archives so vast that we can summon centuries with a click. But knowledge is not the same as understanding. And truth, that most fragile of ideas, is rarely found in the official record. It lingers instead in the margins, in half-erased symbols, in the untranslatable diagrams of a forgotten scientist or scribe who saw farther than his world would allow. This is not a story about conspiracies, it is a story about wonder. About the way human beings have always reached beyond the horizon of what they could explain, and how those moments of reaching, of daring, have left traces even when the world turned away. The archives of civilization are full of ghosts. Some are literal, the remnants of vanished cultures and languages. Others are philosophical, the ghosts of questions we stopped asking because the answers no longer fit the world we wanted to build. Consider the archaeologist bent over a fragment of clay, the historian chasing a rumor of a text that shouldn't exist, the engineer who reads an ancient diagram and feels, inexplicably, that someone thousands of years ago was trying to tell him something he almost understands. These are the people who listen to the whisper beneath the archive, that subtle hum of forgotten knowledge that calls not for belief but for humility. Because when we encounter records that defy explanation, we are not only confronting the mysteries of the past, we are confronting the limits of ourselves, of our certainty, our definitions of civilization, our faith in progress. Perhaps it is not the world that hides its secrets from us. Perhaps it is we who have trained ourselves not to see them. Over the next chapters, we'll journey through 10 records, fragments of memory and imagination that challenge the borders of known history. We'll walk through the damp halls of a Jesuit library where an undeciphered manuscript lies under glass. We'll travel to deserts and mountains, to buried archives and frozen continents, to places where myth and measurement overlap. Each story is a doorway, not to another world, but to a deeper one within our own. Each discovery is less an answer than an invitation to think again about what it means to know. And when it's over, when the last record is read and the last image fades, perhaps we'll understand that history's greatest secret has never been hidden in the past. It has always been hidden in us, in our desire to remember, to connect, to wonder. It began, as many mysteries do, with a man who simply loved old books. In 1912, the antiquarian Wilfrid Voynich stepped into a Jesuit college in northern Italy, a place where dust carried centuries of quiet devotion, and found, tucked among the fading vellum bindings, a manuscript that defied every rule of history. Its pages were luminous with care, painted in pigments that had barely dimmed after 500 years. On them were drawn impossible plants, stems and petals from no known botany, and constellations that mapped a sky no astronomer could recognize. The writing that wove through those pages seemed alive, graceful, fluid, composed in an alphabet never seen before and never deciphered since. Voynich bought the book and carried it into the modern world, certain that somewhere in its elegant chaos was a revelation, perhaps a code, perhaps a lost science. But more than a century later, the Voynich manuscript remains a riddle unbroken. Linguists, cryptographers, and even the best computer algorithms have stared into its looping script and seen only patterns, not meaning. And yet, the book feels deliberate, purposeful. Its drawings are too precise, its rhythm too mathematical to be madness. It is as though the author understood the principles of nature, astronomy, and chemistry, but spoke them in a tongue that time itself forgot. Carbon dating tells us the vellum was made in the early 15th century. But what it contains: flight diagrams that anticipate aerodynamics, botanical illustrations that hint at cellular biology, chemical tables that seem to know the laws of modern pharmacy, feels impossibly ahead of its age. Was it the dream of a genius too strange for his century? A code meant to preserve knowledge in an era when curiosity could be heresy? Or simply an artist's attempt to imagine a world as it might one day be? Over the years, the manuscript has drawn all kinds. Codebreakers from wartime intelligence units, linguists chasing lost languages, even mystics who see in its patterns the blueprint of creation. Each emerges humbled. The text resists every attempt to define it, as though guarding a secret not meant to be possessed, only respected. For a time, the Church held the manuscript under quiet supervision, wary of what it might contain. When Yale University acquired it in the late 1960s, it was cataloged, digitized, displayed. And yet, even in the bright light of scholarship, it remains unknowable. The letters are still letters from nowhere. Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the Voynich manuscript is not meant to tell us what its author knew, but to remind us of what we do not. In a world obsessed with explanation, it stands as a rare act of resistance, a book that refuses to surrender its meaning, a mirror, maybe, for our own longing to translate the universe into words we can control. Sometimes, when visitors stand before its glass case, they describe an odd feeling, a pulse of recognition, as though the book were whispering in a forgotten dialect of the human mind. We will likely never read it, but that does not mean we have not heard it, because every mystery leaves an echo, not in the answer we seek, but in the questions it teaches us to ask. The Voynich manuscript endures not because it hides truth, but because it reminds us that mystery itself is a form of truth, one written in the language of wonder. It begins with a slab of clay, unearthed beneath the dust of Mesopotamia, a land where the first cities rose and the first words were pressed into wet earth. The archaeologists who brushed away the centuries found not a story, but a ledger, a list of kings who had ruled before the Great Flood, before memory itself began. At first glance, the Sumerian king list looks ordinary, a simple record of rulers, reigns, and dynasties. But then the numbers begin to speak, and they speak in impossibilities. Kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years, dynasties that lasted longer than recorded civilization itself. 18,000 years, 65,000. Each reign recorded with the same precision as the next. No flourish, no mythic tone, just fact, as if these long-living kings had walked the same ground we do. Scholars tried to explain it away. Perhaps the numbers were symbolic, or errors in transcription, or exaggerations meant to glorify ancestors. But the consistency across tablets found in different cities, written by different hands, makes that explanation falter. The arithmetic of the ancient world rarely lies without reason. What if the ancients were measuring time differently, or recording something that to them was literal, but to us sounds like metaphor? The king list divides history into two eras, before the flood and after. In the first, life seems to stretch toward eternity. In the second, the reigns grow shorter, the world more human. It is as if some curtain fell over time itself, dividing myth from memory. Archaeology confirms that some of the post-flood kings were real, their cities, their seals, their tombs found in the soil. Which leaves an unsettling question. If the later names are true, what does that mean for the earlier ones? The Sumerians, meticulous in their record-keeping, left us a pattern, reign lengths that follow mathematical cycles tied to lunar and planetary movements. Their calendars mirrored the heavens, their kings bound to cosmic order. The list then might not only be history, but astronomy, an encoded rhythm of the stars. And yet, the deeper meaning of those impossible numbers remains lost. Were they measuring divine years, the lifespan of dynasties, not men, or, as some quietly suggest, remnants of an older knowledge, one that saw time as vast and cyclical, not linear as we do now? Standing before the clay tablets today, one can feel the quiet weight of their certainty. These ancient scribes did not write mythology. They wrote memory and believed it. Maybe the king list is less a record of kings than a record of forgetting. A reminder that what we call the beginning may only be the visible edge of something far older, a civilization whose shadow still flickers beneath the archaeological light. Each generation rewrites the limits of what we think ancient people could know. And each time, the Sumerians stand farther back, smiling through the veil of millennia, as if to say, "We were already old when you began." In the end, the Sumerian king list leaves us with a paradox. If time once moved differently, if lifespans, dynasties, and cosmic cycles were once intertwined, then our notion of history might be just one phase in an endless rotation. Perhaps the ancient scribes were right to begin their list before the flood, because the real story of humanity, like the river that once divided Eden, flows from a source we can no longer see. It began with a photograph, grainy, sun-washed, almost unbelievable. In 1947, an American pilot named James Gaussman flew over central China on a routine mission. Below him, through a break in the clouds, he saw something that should not have been there, a vast pyramid. Rising from the plains of Xi'an, larger and smoother than anything he had seen in Egypt. Its sides gleamed pale in the afternoon light, as if the mountain itself had been shaped by human hands. When the photographs reached the west, they caused a ripple of astonishment, and then, curiously, silence. The Chinese authorities offered little comment. The site was closed to foreign visitors. What had been visible from the air disappeared behind a veil of official denial. But the photographs had already escaped into history, and with them, a question. Who built these pyramids? And why? Over the decades, satellite images confirmed that Gaussman had not been mistaken. Dozens of pyramid-like structures, scattered across Shanxi province, arranged with uncanny geometric precision. Some nearly as tall as the Great Pyramid of Giza, others covered by grass and trees, appearing as natural hills to the untrained eye. Ancient Chinese texts mention these mounds of the sky people, built by emperors said to have descended from above. The oldest accounts describe the builders as masters of levitation and energy, myths perhaps, or metaphors for engineering techniques we no longer understand. One text speaks of stones that floated like feathers when struck by sound, another of dragons of metal that brought the builders to earth. Modern archaeologists, when permitted near the sites, found foundations of enormous blocks fitted with precision beyond known ancient methods. The alignment of the pyramids mirrors constellations, particularly the Belt of Orion, a celestial connection that appears across many ancient cultures. Yet no tools, no clear inscriptions, no datable artifacts explain their origin. Officially, most of the pyramids are now classified as imperial tombs, attributed to early dynasties of Chinese history. But even the most conservative estimates suggest that some of the largest structures predate those dynasties by millennia. Their orientation, material composition, and erosion patterns tell a story that begins before recorded Chinese civilization, before written language itself. Why would a nation so proud of its past conceal a wonder of this scale? Perhaps because the pyramids challenge the tidy progression of history. the idea that human civilization evolved in one continuous line from simple to complex. If these mountains were truly built by ancient hands, they belong to a chapter of humanity we no longer remember. Standing on the plains near Xi'an, one can still glimpse the outline of the White Pyramid through the haze. Its slopes are softened by centuries of wind and vegetation, its summit closed to visitors. The locals call it the Forbidden Mountain. At dusk, it glows faintly gold against the sky, a silent monument to something that has outlasted its name. We may never know who raised these titans of earth and stone or what purpose they served. But perhaps the deeper mystery is not in their origin, but in our response, in the way we choose to look away from what we cannot easily explain. Every age builds its own pyramids, vast, unquestioned structures of belief. And like the emperors who once sought immortality in these monuments, we too hide our uncertainties beneath layers of stone and time. Someday, when the grass recedes and the earth speaks again, the pyramids of China may tell their story. Until then, they remain what all great mysteries are, mirrors that reflect the limits of our knowing. It was not made of stone, but of bark. A book born from trees, written in colors that still glow like embers beneath centuries of ruin. The Madrid Codex, one of the few surviving books of the ancient Maya, is fragile, smaller than a human hand, and yet within its pages unfolds a universe so precise it makes our modern calendars seem almost naive. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Yucatan, they burned thousands of such books. To them, they were pagan works, vessels of forbidden knowledge. Only 4 are known to have survived, scattered like orphans across the world's museums. The Madrid Codex is one of them, a survivor of fire and conquest, a whisper of the civilization that once charted the cosmos from the jungles of Central America. To the untrained eye, its pages are chaos, painted glyphs, animal figures, cycles of gods and stars. But to those who study it, the Codex reveals an intelligence of astonishing depth. The Maya charted solar eclipses, Venus cycles, planetary alignments, not for years or centuries, but for millennia. Their calculations could predict cosmic events far into the future, with an accuracy modern astronomers find humbling. They had mastered the concept of zero, a mathematical idea that Europe would not rediscover for nearly 1,000 years. They recorded time as a spiral, not a line, an eternal return, where endings and beginnings were one and the same. In their worldview, the cosmos was alive. Every motion of a planet was a breath, every eclipse a pulse in the body of time. Their mathematics was not abstraction. It was devotion, a way of aligning human life with the heartbeat of the universe. The Madrid Codex shows intricate diagrams, what some describe as early analog computers, mechanical devices designed to track celestial movements. Whether symbolic or functional, they reveal a people for whom science and spirit were never separate. Their astronomers were priests, their equations prayers. Yet for all its sophistication, the Codex carries a haunting melancholy. Its ink bleeds at the edges, as if mourning the thousands of others lost to fire. We can almost hear the crackle of those flames, centuries of knowledge turned to ash in the name of salvation. Today, the Madrid Codex sits under glass in Madrid's Museo de América, protected but still not fully understood. Scholars debate its purpose, its authorship, its meaning. But perhaps what matters most is not what the Maya knew, but how they knew, through observation, patience, and reverence for the infinite cycles of the sky. The Western mind often divides science from myth, fact from faith. The Maya saw no such border. To them, mathematics was poetry written in the stars. Astronomy was not about prediction, but participation, a way of keeping rhythm with eternity. And maybe that's why their calendar still fascinates us. Because deep down, we too feel the pull of time's circle, the sense that we've been here before, not in body, but in memory. The Madrid Codex reminds us that civilization is not only measured in tools and empires, but in how we listen to the universe. It tells us that knowledge, like time, is not linear. It expands, contracts, and returns, endlessly, like breath. When we stare at its painted pages, we are looking at a mind that refused to separate logic from wonder. A civilization that did not merely count the days, but conversed with them. Perhaps that is why the book survived when so many others did not. Because the Codex was never just a record of time, it was a prayer, written not to the gods, but to the universe itself. When Nikola Tesla died in a modest New York hotel room in 1943, he was 86 years old and nearly forgotten, a man whose imagination had once illuminated the world, now flickering in the shadows of history. The newspapers spoke of eccentricity and genius in equal measure, but what drew the government to his door that winter night was not his fame, it was his papers. For decades, Tesla had kept meticulous notebooks, dense with sketches, equations, and ideas that few could follow. He wrote of wireless energy, vibration frequencies, and what he called the music of the spheres, as though electricity itself were a language waiting to be sung. After his death, the FBI confiscated those notes, labeling them classified. The files have never been fully released. In those pages, Tesla dreamed of a world without wires, where energy flowed through the air as freely as wind or sound. He had already proven the concept in part, lighting lamps miles away from his transmitter at Colorado Springs. But his vision was more radical still: global wireless power transmitted through the Earth's resonant frequency, an invisible grid, limitless and clean. To investors, it was madness. To Tesla, it was inevitability. The tower he built at Wardenclyffe, 180 feet of copper and steel, was meant to be the first heartbeat of that new world. But when financiers realized it could transmit energy freely, beyond the reach of meters and bills, the funding vanished. The tower was demolished in 1917, and with it, perhaps, the dream of universal light. In his later years, Tesla spoke of forces that transcended gravity, of vibrations that could lift objects and open paths to the stars. He hinted at communication with other worlds, not through fantasy, but through frequency. To him, the universe was not empty space, but a sea of energy, waiting for harmony. Some see these ideas as the delusions of an aging mind. Yet in the quiet of modern laboratories, scientists still chase fragments of Tesla's visions: wireless charging, energy resonance, electromagnetic propulsion. Concepts that, a century later, are no longer magic, only unfinished. What makes Tesla's story haunting is not that his discoveries were stolen or suppressed, but that his faith in the boundless potential of knowledge was too vast for his time. He believed energy, like truth, like light, should belong to everyone. He built for humanity, not profit, and that may have been his undoing. When his notebooks disappeared into government archives, so too did the final chapters of his imagination. What remains are fragments, circuit diagrams, notes on frequencies, cryptic equations, like prayers written to the future. Perhaps the real mystery isn't what Tesla discovered, but why we keep forgetting him. Each generation rediscovers his brilliance, and each, somehow, lets it fade again, as though his ideas burned too brightly to hold. Tesla once said, "The day science begins to study non-physical phenomena, it will make more progress in one decade than in all the previous centuries of its existence." Maybe he wasn't speaking about technology. Maybe he meant understanding, that to know the universe, we must also learn to hear its silence. Standing before the ruins of Wardenclyffe today, the earth still hums faintly with buried copper and lost intention. Birds nest where the tower once reached for the sky, and if you listen carefully, past the hum of the wires and the wind in the grass, you can almost hear it, a low, steady pulse, the echo of a dream that wanted to light the world. It was the sound of breaking pottery that changed history. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd threw a stone into a cave in the cliffs above the Dead Sea, and instead of an echo, he heard the sharp crack of clay. When he climbed inside, he found jars filled with ancient scrolls, their parchment wrapped in linen, their ink still dark after 2,000 years. At first, no one understood what they were. The shepherd sold them to a dealer in Bethlehem for a few coins. Within months, scholars realized what the world had stumbled upon, fragments of the oldest biblical texts ever discovered. But among the hymns and prophecies, there were other writings too, strange, technical, and unnervingly precise. These became known collectively as the Dead Sea Scrolls, the library of a forgotten community, perhaps the Essenes, who lived on the edge of the desert, awaiting the end of the world. But the scrolls contained more than religious hope. Some spoke of astronomy, metallurgy, and measurement, subjects that seemed far ahead of their time. One of the most mysterious was the Copper Scroll, not written on parchment, but hammered into sheets of pure metal. It listed, in matter-of-fact detail, the locations of vast treasures and artifacts buried throughout the region. Some researchers saw it as metaphor. Others suspected it hid something more, a record of lost technologies or sacred knowledge meant to survive catastrophe. Other fragments contained precise celestial calculations, eclipses, planetary positions, and cosmic cycles described with astonishing accuracy. How could a desert sect 2 millennia ago possess such understanding of the heavens? Were they inheritors of a forgotten tradition or simply observers with extraordinary patience? Over the decades, only portions of the scrolls were made public. Some were withheld, locked in institutional vaults for decades. The official explanation was that the translation process was slow, the fragments too delicate. Yet rumors grew, of scrolls that spoke of watchers, beings who descended from the sky to teach humanity hidden arts, metallurgy, medicine, even writing itself. It's tempting to dismiss such accounts as myth, but within the language of ancient texts, myth often masks metaphor. The watchers could have been symbols of knowledge, or reminders of how dangerous wisdom can seem when it arrives too soon. The scrolls that have been released continue to astonish. They show a civilization deeply observant of both heaven and earth, one that measured time not just by faith, but by the movement of stars. Their mathematical precision suggests that even in the most remote corners of the ancient world, people were already reaching for the universe. What remains most striking, though, is not the knowledge they contain, but the silence that surrounded them. For nearly 50 years, access to many scrolls was controlled by a small circle of scholars. When they were finally made public in the 1990s, much of what had been whispered proved untrue, yet the pattern was revealing. It showed how easily institutions fear what might rewrite the story they tell. Perhaps the real treasure buried in those caves was not gold or technology, but humility, a reminder that revelation often arrives in fragments, and that the divine and the scientific may be written in the same ink. When you stand at Qumran today, the desert wind still moves through the caves like breath through an old instrument. The Dead Sea glows pale and metallic in the distance. And somewhere in that stillness you can almost feel it, the weight of a question 2,000 years old. What is more sacred, the truth itself or our readiness to accept it? The wind in Antarctica has no voice. It screams and howls, yes, but what it says is swallowed by distance, a sound older than language. In 1947, Admiral Richard E. Byrd flew above that frozen world and listened to its silence. What he wrote afterward would haunt both skeptics and dreamers for generations. Byrd was no ordinary explorer. Decorated, disciplined, and famously cautious, he had charted both poles and pioneered the logistics of modern exploration. When he embarked on Operation High Jump, the largest Antarctic expedition in history, it was presented as a mission of science and national pride. But somewhere over the white expanse, according to his private diary, something extraordinary occurred. The diary, found years later among his papers, describes a flight beyond mapped territory into a region where the ice gave way to green valleys and rivers of liquid water. He wrote of a warm zone hidden beneath the polar sheet, where vegetation thrived and the air shimmered with strange light. Most remarkably, he claimed to have encountered beings, tall, pale, and calm, who spoke to him not with words, but through thought. To them, he said, he was a guest, a visitor from a world that had lost its balance. They warned of humanity's growing obsession with power, of weapons that could tear the fabric of the earth itself. Your skies will burn, they told him, and your oceans will rise. It sounds like myth, and perhaps it is. No official record of such an encounter exists. His mission reports were classified, and his notes, the ones that survived, are written in a careful, almost coded hand. But even stripped of the supernatural, Byrd's accounts describe phenomena that science has since confirmed. Vast subsurface lakes, geothermal regions, and unexplored networks of caverns beneath the Antarctic ice. If his story seems unbelievable, it may be because Antarctica itself is unbelievable. A continent twice the size of Australia, 98% buried beneath a sheet of ice miles thick, still largely uncharted beneath its surface. What lies beneath that silence remains one of Earth's last great mysteries. In the years after Operation High Jump, international treaties placed Antarctica under strict control. No nation owns it. No private excavation is allowed. The official explanation is protection of the environment, and it is a noble one. Yet to the curious mind, the timing feels poetic. Just when humanity reached the last untouched frontier, it was locked away. Byrd died in 1957, just before the world's powers signed the Antarctic Treaty. His legacy became the stuff of documentaries and folklore, caught between admiration and disbelief. Was he the last of the great explorers, or the first to glimpse something we were not meant to see? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere quieter. Maybe his vision, real or imagined, was a metaphor for the fragile balance between exploration and exploitation, between discovery and restraint. Byrd, who once said that the goal of every explorer was to bring light into darkness, may have realized too late that some lights burn too fiercely. Standing on the ice today, one feels an immense stillness, a silence that stretches beyond comprehension. Beneath it, ancient rivers flow, unseen. There may be no lost civilizations there, no hidden cities or messages from beyond. And yet the deeper mystery remains untouched, that every frontier, once crossed, changes not the world, but the explorer. Perhaps Byrd's greatest discovery was not a hidden land beneath the ice, but the mirror it held, reflecting how small and how restless we truly are. In the cool shadows of an Egyptian temple, beneath the murmured prayers of tourists and the scent of old incense, lie walls inscribed with stories the modern world prefers to forget. Among the hieroglyphs of gods and kings, scholars once found strange maps, outlines of lands that should not exist. One of them, marked by symbols of light and water, was called Atlantis. For centuries, Atlantis has floated between myth and metaphor, a civilization spoken of by Plato as a moral parable, a warning about pride and loss. But the temple records found in the 19th century seem to speak differently. They describe trade routes across the ocean, alliances with western lands beyond the sunset, and an island kingdom rich in metals, energy, and knowledge. The texts were detailed, technical even, naming coordinates that did not fit the Mediterranean world and describing ships that seemed to move not by sail, but by power. Whether invention or memory, the words carried a strange authority, as if they had been copied from even older records. The Egyptians had a word for such knowledge, Zep Tepi, the first time, the age before history began. They believed civilization had risen before, shining and fallen, leaving behind echoes carved in stone. To the priests who preserved those records, Atlantis was not a fable, but an inheritance, the memory of an earlier dawn. In one inscription, an Atlantean envoy is said to have brought the wisdom of the stars and the fire of the earth. The phrase may sound poetic, but to modern readers it conjures images of technologies, energy, metallurgy, flight, far beyond the world of the pharaohs. Could the myth of Atlantis then be less about geography and more about memory? The memory of something humanity once achieved and then lost? When European archaeologists found these fragments, they stirred excitement and discomfort alike. Some saw them as evidence that civilization is older and more cyclical than we admit. Others warned that to search for Atlantis in history is to miss its meaning. And perhaps both are true. Every culture has its story of a lost world, Lemuria, Mu, Eden, the Golden Age. They differ in detail, but not in spirit. Each speaks of a fall, a moment when humanity's reach exceeded its wisdom. Maybe the flood that swallowed Atlantis was not of water, but of time, the inevitable erosion of knowledge when it outpaces humility. What fascinates about Atlantis is not whether it existed, but why we need it to. It stands as our mirror, the dream of perfection and the fear of ruin intertwined. To imagine Atlantis is to imagine ourselves at our height and at our end, all at once. Today, oceanographers scan the seafloor for patterns, for ruins beneath the waves that might confirm what Plato hinted. None have found certainty. Yet when satellites map the ocean ridges and the currents that circle the globe, we cannot help but see in them the shapes of forgotten continents, ghost coastlines erased by the tide. Maybe Atlantis was never a place, but a promise that knowledge, like the tide, will always return, reshaped, reimagined, reborn in another age. As the Nile continues to rise and fall beside its ancient stones, the temple walls whisper a truth, older than history, that civilizations do not truly vanish, they transform. Their wisdom sinks into the depths of memory, waiting for those who remember how to listen. And in that sense, perhaps we are all Atlanteans, survivors of forgotten ages, building again, dreaming again, never quite certain which shore we stand upon. The Andes rise like the bones of the earth, sharp and eternal, cutting the clouds into ribbons of light. High among them, where the air thins and the stars seem close enough to touch, the Inca built their empire, an empire not only of stone and gold, but of understanding. To the Spanish who came after, it seemed impossible that such knowledge could exist without writing. Yet the Inca recorded everything, not with ink, but with thread. Their quipu, cords knotted in complex patterns, were not mere ledgers, but a kind of language, a system capable of carrying numbers, calendars, and perhaps even stories. Among the chronicles left by Spanish priests and explorers are mentions of something stranger still, libraries of astronomical records that the conquerors could not read and so destroyed. Those records, they wrote, spoke of times before the sun was born, and of teachers who came from the sky. To modern ears, these phrases sound like myth. But the Inca were astronomers in the purest sense. They lived by the heavens. Their calendars tracked the cycles of the moon, Venus, and the Pleiades with extraordinary precision. Their temples, like the fortress of Sacsayhuaman and the observatory at Machu Picchu, were aligned not to chance, but to solstices, equinoxes, and invisible constellations formed by dark clouds in the Milky Way. They understood time not as a straight road, but as a wheel. Each era turned until it was consumed and born again. The world renewed through destruction. The Incas' stories of earlier ages may not be fantasies of gods, but memories of lost civilizations passed down through ritual and architecture. One colonial account tells of the Amautas, the wise ones who preserved knowledge from the first peoples, those who came before the flood that reshaped the earth. They carried metal instruments, the record says, to measure the sky. Whether those instruments were real or metaphorical, their legacy endured in stone. The temples of Cusco and Ollantaytambo, built with such precision that their blocks, some weighing dozens of tons, fit together without mortar, as if shaped by sound rather than tools. Metallurgy, too, reached extraordinary sophistication. The Inca and their predecessors could alloy metals with techniques modern engineers only rediscovered in the 20th century. Their artifacts shimmer with iridescent hues, not decoration, but chemistry. It's tempting to romanticize such achievements as miracles, but they were born of patience, observation, and devotion to balance, between earth and sky, science and spirit. The Inca believed that to understand the heavens, one must first live in harmony with the land beneath. And perhaps that is the wisdom we have lost. In our hunger to explore outward, we forget the knowledge that begins within, the kind that measures not stars, but meaning. When the conquistadors burned the Inca records, they thought they were erasing superstition. In truth, they destroyed a mirror, one that reflected a way of seeing the universe as a living whole. Even now, astronomers in Peru retrace the alignments of ancient temples, finding accuracy that rivals modern instruments. The stone corridors of Machu Picchu still mark the path of the sun. The shadow of a window becomes a calendar. Perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of the Inca astronomers, not their lost technologies or whispered myths, but the reminder that knowledge is not always written in books. Sometimes it's carved in stone, carried in the rhythm of seasons, or kept in the silence between stars. As night falls over the Andes, the sky blooms with 1,000 suns, and one can almost feel the pulse of the old empire beneath the ground, a civilization that measured the heavens not to conquer them, but to remember its place within them. Beneath the streets of Rome, behind marble halls and locked iron gates, lies a world that few have ever seen. The Vatican's secret archives, now called the Apostolic Archive, stretch for miles beneath the city, a labyrinth of sealed corridors and climate-controlled vaults. Inside are the papers of popes, the letters of kings, and the secrets of a faith that has shaped half of human history. But among the centuries of theology and diplomacy, rumor insists that something else is kept there. Manuscripts that do not fit the story of salvation or empire. Records of technologies, encounters, or philosophies the Church once knew but chose to forget. It is a rumor that refuses to die, perhaps because every institution that endures for 2,000 years must learn the art of silence. The origins of this mystique are simple enough. During the Middle Ages, the Vatican was the center of scholarship as well as belief. Monks copied texts from Greece, Egypt, and the East, not only the Gospels, but treatises on astronomy, medicine, and alchemy. Many were never translated. Some were banned as heretical. Yet they were not destroyed. They were stored, catalogued, preserved, and then, slowly, forgotten. Among historians, there are tales of letters describing visitors from the heavens, of diagrams that anticipate the mechanics of flight, of maps showing continents long before they were discovered. Most of these stories cannot be verified, but what gives them life is the fact that the Vatican never entirely denies them. It simply declines to comment. In truth, secrecy in such archives is not sinister, but protective. Paper decays, ink fades. Access is restricted because the past is fragile. And yet, the imagination cannot resist. What if those vaults hold evidence of earlier knowledge? Knowledge the Church once glimpsed and then hid, fearing that the world was not ready. One of the few verified documents, a 13th century letter between scholars, describes machines that fly by the grace of geometry. Another recounts the Inquisition's investigation into a man who claimed to speak with beings not of this firmament. The Church preserved even these records, perhaps not because it believed them, but because it understood that disbelief too is part of history. To walk the corridors of the Vatican Library today is to feel the pulse of time compressed. There are scrolls written when Latin was new, drawings by Galileo, and papal decrees that once determined the fates of empires. The air hums with the weight of centuries. and with the quiet awareness that faith and knowledge have never truly been enemies, only uneasy companions. If there is a secret hidden here, it may not be one of lost technologies or alien contact. It may be something simpler and far more human, that throughout history, power and understanding have always danced together in fragile balance. The Church preserved the wisdom of the ancients even as it feared it. It sheltered the light while warning of its fire. And perhaps that is why these archives continue to fascinate. They remind us that knowledge, once discovered, cannot be unlearned. It can only be guarded. Outside, the bells of Rome toll through the night. Inside, the pages sleep in darkness, their words pressed like seeds beneath the soil of time. Maybe one day they will bloom again, not as proof of conspiracy, but as testimony to our endless need to seek, to question, and to remember that even within the walls of faith, curiosity was never truly silenced. Every age believes it is the first to awaken, the first to see clearly, to cut through superstition and myth. Yet, again and again, history reminds us that knowledge does not vanish through ignorance alone. It vanishes through choice, through silence. Look across the centuries and you can trace a pattern, not of conspiracy, but of fear. Fear of what knowledge can do and what it might undo. A new discovery arrives, and for a moment it shines like dawn. Then the light becomes too bright, too disruptive, and someone decides it is better not to see. The pattern is ancient. A manuscript too strange for its century is sealed away in a Jesuit library. A stone tablet that rewrites the timeline of kings is labeled as mythological. A pyramid too vast for the comfort of chronology becomes a natural hill. Each act of dismissal feels small, reasonable even, yet together they weave a silence strong enough to shape history itself. It is easy to imagine this as malice, the work of hidden hands. But most of the time it is something subtler, self-preservation. Institutions, like people, cling to coherence. To admit that the past might be deeper, older, or more complex than we believed is to reopen every question we've closed. And questions, once opened, are hard to contain. Consider the burned libraries of the Maya, the shattered observatories of the Inca, the confiscated notes of Nikola Tesla. None were destroyed by ignorance alone. They were lost to the same impulse that drives us still, the wish for certainty. We fear uncertainty because it demands humility. It reminds us that progress is not a straight ascent, but a cycle of remembering and forgetting. Each civilization builds upon the ruins of the last, not just in stone, but in thought. The irony is that every time we declare an idea impossible, we are only echoing the same words once spoken to those who proved us wrong. Silence is not always forced. Sometimes it is chosen. A scholar decides a topic is too fringe to risk reputation. A museum omits a detail that might confuse the public. A discovery that cannot be explained is postponed, waiting for a time when the world is ready. But the world is never quite ready. And yet, silence has its own wisdom. Perhaps not everything is meant to be known at once. Perhaps knowledge, like light, must arrive gradually, filtered through the centuries, soft enough for us to bear it. The real tragedy is not that we hide knowledge, but that we forget why it mattered. Each suppressed record is also a lost emotion, the awe, the doubt, the courage of those who once tried to reach beyond the horizon. The historian, the scientist, the philosopher, they are not enemies of mystery. They are its caretakers. Their task is not to end wonder, but to preserve it from distortion. Maybe the pattern of silence is less a curse than a cycle, one that reminds us that truth cannot be owned, only rediscovered again and again by those willing to listen. When you walk through a museum or a library, notice the empty spaces, the unmarked shelves, the exhibits that speak in half-phrases. Those absences are not voids, they are questions. And in that quiet, between what was recorded and what was erased, you may begin to hear the faint hum of history's heartbeat, still alive beneath the dust. Because knowledge never truly disappears. It only waits for us to remember that seeking it is what makes us human. Somewhere, in every age, a flame is passed. Sometimes it takes the form of a book, a formula, or a vision seen in the stars. Sometimes it is a whisper, a reminder that what has been lost can be found again if one listens closely enough. This is the echo of knowledge, a rhythm that survives even when civilizations do not. It moves through time like a current beneath still water. A monk copying an old Greek text he barely understands. An engineer rediscovering principles once dismissed as myth. A child staring at the night sky and feeling, without knowing why, that the universe is speaking to them. The knowledge never truly dies. It changes language, hides in symbols, disguises itself as art or faith, and waits for those who are ready to hear it. Consider how ideas resurface. The heliocentric model, lost for centuries after the fall of Alexandria, reappeared in the equations of Copernicus. Ancient Indian mathematics anticipated calculus long before Europe gave it a name. The mythic dreams of flight became aeronautics. Each discovery, when it returns, feels new, yet it is always older than we think. There is something profoundly human in this repetition. We forget not because we are careless, but because memory itself is fragile, bound to flesh, to politics, to language. Empires fall, libraries burn, but curiosity endures. It leaps across the ruins, carrying with it the faint memory of what once was possible. Even myths carry embers of forgotten truths. The story of Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity, is not only a tale of rebellion, it is a parable of rediscovery. Fire was not invented, it was remembered. When we look at the great enigmas of history, the Voynich manuscript, the pyramids, the codices, Tesla's visions, perhaps we are not glimpsing alien knowledge or lost worlds, but reflections of ourselves at different stages of awakening. Each mystery is an echo, a resonance of humanity's ongoing dialogue with the unknown. That echo calls us still. It is in the hum of machines, the patterns of DNA, the silence of deep space. We are surrounded by mysteries, not because the world hides them, but because we have not yet learned the right way to listen. Maybe this is what knowledge truly is, not a possession, but a relationship, an endless conversation between the known and the unknowable. The echo persists because it is not only carried by data or text, but by longing, by the human will to understand. And with each rediscovery, the fire brightens a little more. A scientist reading equations by the dim light of a lab. An artist painting the same cosmic spirals found in Neolithic caves. A child asking, why, for the 1000th time. That is how knowledge survives, not through institutions or archives, but through the unbroken chain of wonder that links one generation to the next. Perhaps that is the gift left to us by all the lost civilizations and forbidden books, not their answers, but their questions. They remind us that truth is not a monument to be built, but a light to be tended. The fire has never gone out. It flickers in our art, our science, our faith. It glows in every attempt to name what cannot yet be explained. And though the centuries may bury it beneath war, fear, or forgetfulness, the echo always returns. It is the sound of humanity thinking, endlessly, bravely, in the dark. At the end of every age, when the dust of empires settles and the echoes of faith and reason fade into the background hum of time, something always remains. Not the monuments, not the names, but the faint shimmer of light, the memory of understanding, flickering like an ember that refuses to die. History, it turns out, is not a straight path of progress. It is a constellation, moments of brilliance connected by vast spaces of forgetting. The manuscript that no one can read, the stone tablet that speaks of impossible kings, the pyramid that watches the horizon in silence. They are not contradictions to history, they are its conscience. They remind us that the story of humanity is far larger than our version of it. What then do these mysteries ask of us? Not belief, not obedience, but humility, the courage to say we don't yet know, and to let that unknowing inspire wonder instead of fear. Perhaps this is what every explorer, scientist, monk, and dreamer has been seeking all along. Not certainty, but connection. To see how everything, the stars, the oceans, the atoms of our bodies, participates in a single, unfinished thought called existence. The ancient world seemed to know this. The Mayan priests who charted the skies, the Sumerian scribes who measured kings by the rhythm of the heavens, the Inca astronomers who built their cities in dialogue with the sun, all of them lived within the conversation, not outside it. Their knowledge was not separate from their reverence. They studied the world as one listens to music, not to dissect it, but to join in its rhythm. And then came forgetting, the burning of libraries, the silencing of heretics, the centuries of certainty that mistook control for wisdom. Yet even then, the light endured, hidden in the quiet persistence of curiosity. Every age has its custodians of wonder, those who look at the world not as a solved equation, but as a living mystery. To stand in a museum or a desert ruin or a midnight observatory is to realize that we are the same species that once carved calendars into stone and asked the stars for meaning. We are the continuation of a question that began long before we learned to write and will echo long after we are gone. Maybe that is what history really is, the memory of light carried through darkness by fragile hands. And maybe the task of our own time is not to uncover every secret, but to learn how to live with the wonder that remains. To protect it, to pass it on, because the danger is not that we will know too little, but that we will forget how to be amazed. Look around you, at the cities pulsing with electric light, the data flowing invisibly through the air, the machines that speak in human voices. These, too, are artifacts, no less mysterious than the scrolls and pyramids we marvel at. The future will study us the same way we study the ancients, with awe, with confusion, with the same unending question, how did they know? The cycle continues. The fire moves on. And somewhere, perhaps in a cave, perhaps in a digital archive centuries from now, a single human mind will stumble upon a fragment, a page, a signal, a sentence, and feel that sudden, trembling recognition. They will not yet understand what it means, but they will know it means something, and that, as ever, will be enough to begin again.